Now, Michael Harding is a writer, podcaster and commentator, man who I think understands the human condition better than most, but he has had plays, a number of plays in fact, staged at the Abbey Theatre. He's written books of fiction and he's had an acclaim. More recently, he's had an acclaimed series of memoirs, starting with Staring at Lakes back in 2013. And then more recently, I Loved Him from the Day He Died, which came out last year. He also writes a column for the Irish Times, and you might hear his voice on a number of documentary programmes. But the year before last, he headed off. Listen, he can tell us because he's here in the studio. I'm delighted to say to chat about a show. It's a chance to spend some time with him in An Grianan Theatre. It's an evening with Michael Harding. It's happening tomorrow week, Thursday the 10th, in An Grianan Theatre in Letterkenny. Michael.
John, how are you?
Good to see you again.
Great to be here.
Good.
Yeah.
Good. I was just going to go into that bit about you walking the Camino and stuff. And the last time we were chatting, you touched on it. In fact, one of the things I remember was the suit that you said that you had on it.
That's right.
And it served you. The footwear didn't do as good as the suit did.
No. And I can't talk about the footwear because it can't be given off about certain brands. But
Right.
The footwear, God, I spent a fierce amount on the footwear, like €150. And they didn't do my feet any good at all on the Camino.
Was it rocky? Or
I don't know what it was. It was a bit of rocky, but after about 2 days, I went into some shop in some town and I bought a pair of sandals for €20 and they were perfect.
Sandals?
Aye.
They saw you through.
Absolutely. And I had this mad notion to see, I wanted to walk the Camino with my father. He died 50 years ago. And I says, I'll take him with me because in the past year or two, I'm gone 70, and I look in the mirror, and I do see him looking back at me. Right. You know, the same face, the same old grey hair coming. So
you were very young. You were young.
I was very young. I was 21, but he was 73. Like he was 50 before he married.
Okay.
And so he was one of those men. Do you know, they're like Edwardian men. They're men that were my generation's fathers. So they were born like in about 1910. Mm-hmm. And they were very stiff and formal. And they could have been very good fathers and they'd be there for you. And they'd make sure you got your, money to go to college or something. And they'd never be angry. They might never be in a pub. My father was not a man who went to the pubs at all. But he was remote. Do you know what I mean? He wasn't intimate. He wouldn't give you a hug. And he used to live in a big armchair. He had an armchair in the front room and a big standard lamp behind it, and he'd sit there reading books day and night, and you might go in and knock the door to say good night to him, and that'd be about it now. And that was normal. Like, that was normal in our house. It wasn't that he was aloof, and he couldn't cook. Like, he didn't know nothing about cooking. The mother used to, when she'd be going to the golf, sometimes of an evening, if she wasn't going to be back, she might meet her friends from Cavan and have a few gin and tonics, right? Lovely. So she'd say, I'll leave you a boiled egg. And the egg it wouldn't be boiled, it'd be just in the shell and it'd be in the pot, white enamel pot, and water in the pot. And it'd sit on the ring and all he'd have to do is come into the kitchen and turn the button to turn on the ring.
Fairly straightforward.
If there wasn't water in that pot, that man would have turned the button anyway. Like, he knew nothing. But he's grand.
As the old saying goes, he could hardly boil it.
Yeah. And then he died, and I felt sad.
Was he, like, when you were then growing up, say, through your 20s and 30s, was he the father that did you think about him too much, or did you think about him much? And was he the father that you really wanted, or did you think that you could have had a different type of father? I
kind of envied the young fellas that were my age, because you'd be in Breffney Park in Cavan and they'd all be shouting. They'd have fathers that were on football teams and they'd be there shouting, come on, Daddy. And Daddy would be out there on the pitch in a pair of short trousers, right, or a Cavan jersey. And he'd have big, he'd be a big supple man, a big Cook Holland, you know what I mean? Big warrior kind of a fella. And he'd be kicking balls 50, metres down the pitch or 50 yards down the pitch, and they'd be thinking, oh, great man. My father was a frail little man. He was like, when I was 10, he was over 60, and he'd be sitting there like in a deck chair in the summer with a little bit of a hanky on his head to keep him from the sun, and he'd be reading his books. So he wasn't the kind of a warrior father that you'd be proud of and you'd want to be kind of emulating.
No, but with all this talk,
He was kind and gentle.
With all this talk about toxic masculinity, he was a million miles away from that. But that's no bad. That's obviously no bad thing.
He created. He was like a mountain. It's like Errigal is always there, and there's a strange reassurance you find when you drive around the corner every so often and you see Errigal. Mm-hmm. It's like it's there. It'll always be there. And my father was like that. He was a mountain. He was a rock. Emotionally, like he approved of you, he encouraged you. He used to encourage me to write when I was about 16 years of age. My first poems, I'd show him, and he'd be encouraging it. Do you know what I mean? So, and I think the one thing that you need from a father is encouragement. And I think there's a lot talked about now in relation to the Adolescence film that was on Netflix, and people will come up with all sorts of very complex theories now about adolescence. But it really is only one thing your child needs, and that's encouragement, no matter what. Do you know what I mean? If your child comes in and says they want to be a nuclear physicist and you think they're not so good at the maths, just say good. You'll be a great nuclear physicist. And always say to them then, and if it doesn't work out, you can always try something else.
So was your problem with your
My father was like that.
Which is brilliant. But was your problem with your father the fact that you were born too late, that he was too old,
and he was remote? He spent his whole time sitting reading in a chair, so there was no hugs, there was no playfulness. For example, I found when I had a child, I found it hard to play with my child. I found it hard to go out and kick a ball for half an hour. I thought it was boring because I never did that with my father, right? So there was no playfulness, there was no great hugging, there was no great sort of sharing in the domesticity that my mother had to control. She had to do everything. And he expected her to do everything. The only thing was she never had to want for money. Like the checks were always there because he worked. Do you know?
Was it a happy house?
I would say it was a peaceful house. I was happy, but to be honest, it lacked the sort of joy that you can have in a household now when the father is more involved. Like when the father is more involved emotionally. I found like as a father when I had an adolescent, that you need to be able to fail in front of your child. Do you know what I mean? You need to be more than just an authority.
You saw your father cry once.
Yeah.
It had an impact on you.
Yeah. There was only once I went into the kitchen and it was like I used to catch them in their intimacy. Your
mum and dad?
Yeah. I went in and there they were, and there was some kind of problem going on in his work that upset him. I think it was a kind of bullying went on. But he was in tears. And she was there with him. And there was another time I remember when I was at college, I came home and I went in the door very quick without announcing myself and ran up the stairs because he was old at this stage and he was in the bed. And she was sitting at the bedside with him, holding his hand. And I could see that it was as romantic as if they were in their 20s. Do you know what I mean? But they didn't show you that. So that, for example, when he passed away, and I was, we'll say, 21 years of age, I hadn't got around to asking him the big questions that you'd like to ask your father now, like did you have sex or how were we born? Do you know what I mean? Because when you have a father who's 70 years of age, in those days, you can't imagine him having anything to do with, the things that an adolescent is interested in.
But with an Irish fathers as they were back then, even if he was half the age, you wouldn't have asked him them kind of questions.
No, and you wouldn't even, when you think about, like, everybody knows about, say, birth nowadays. And in those days we knew less. But the idea of your father ever telling you, forget it. I know. He'd give you a slap.
So, in a way, the two of you headed off on the Camino anyhow.
Yeah, and because I love suits, right? I have second-hand suits all the time. This suit here would have cost me about a fiver, right? And I had a lovely suit, and it's an old-fashioned suit that I bought in a second-hand shop in Castlereagh. And I says, I'll wear that on the Camino as a kind of a memento. It was a way of kind of remembering him, because I looked so like him.
He always wore suits.
Always had a suit on him. Yeah, very formal. And I used to wear, I had a rucksack, so I'd put the jacket in the rucksack. And it was a suit that there was silk, believe it or not, in the suit. Second-hand suit, but it was a very good suit. And there was silk in the trousers. So that dries off. If you have a shower of rain on the Camino, it would dry off very quickly. And what I didn't want to look like, the Camino was full of old men. Well, it's full of young men and old women and young women. But the old men I'd be looking at, because I'm 70, right? And they'd be in big boots that they bought in a camper shop, and they'd have big socks on them and short trousers and 2 sticks, and they'd be marching along. You'd think they were going to go up Everest, And I'd be saying to myself, well, I don't want to look like that now, I want to look just normal. So
normal, I don't know, a suit and a pair of sandals. I don't know if that would be the definition of normal, but you made it. And the suit was as good as Gore-Tex. In other words, it dried out quickly after.
Yeah.
And did you from the walk on the Camino and doing this all this reflection about your father, did it achieve its purpose?
I think hugely, yeah. I think there was a moment, accidentally, about 6 months after I came home, and I went to his grave. And I always went to that grave. I would call it my mother's grave. On Grave Sunday, I'd say, I'm going to the mother's grave. And I'd never mention him, even though he'd be buried there as well. And there was another thing, like I went to the grave, and I felt that I realised in that gesture, I brought flowers to the grave. Now, again, I'd always done it for my mother, and I had written, at this stage, I think 8 books of memoir. I talked about my mother so often. I talk about Leitrim. I talk about Cavan. I have 1 book, chest pain, about Donegal. But I realised after 8 books, I'd never mentioned my father. And so going on the Camino, it opened up my heart to be able to say, look, I didn't understand you, but I loved you. And I didn't realise I loved you when you were alive. But from the day you died, there was some gap in me, there was some loss in me, there was some grief in me, that finally I realised that's the lack of love. And I was able to go to the grave and kind of bid him farewell and thank him. But to be able to say, not that I didn't understand you, but that I loved you. And that's it. Yeah, so it did a lot for me.
The book is a great title. I loved him from the day he died. So the show is based on that, and it's going to be in An Grianan Theatre, as I said earlier, and tomorrow night week. You have a good graph for Donegal as well. You spend a lot of time up here.
I love Donegal. I was, in my teenage years, we had two girls in the house that were from Letterkenny, and for many years afterwards, another Letterkenny woman who became, I would say, nearly my half-sister. She was so long in our family. I knew my father so well and loved him too. So I've had huge connections with Donegal, and I have a base here now, and we're here in Farishta, and I'll be out there writing away.
So it's a spot to give you inspiration.
Yeah, and I have lovely night. I have to say, on Grianan, I've done it every time with every book, and we've had a great fun night for an hour and 20 minutes or so. Yeah,
good.
So I love Donegal
because a lot of it is fun. I mean, the subjects that you deal with, they're often very deep, and it's what you do is very personal, but there's a light tone to it all. Nearly all your writings, and the same on stage.
Yeah, I think that life brings us grief, and it brings us pain, and it brings us ill health, and it brings us all sorts of losses. And that's before you start worrying about the politics, which everybody's worried about now. But I really believe that there's something available in every individual in your own heart that has a lightness to it. That there's something You can put it in religious terms if you want, like, be not afraid. Phrases like that you'll get all over religious text in any religion, whether it's Buddhist or Christian. Be not afraid. There's a lovely woman, Julian of Norwich, 13th century. She used to say, all will be well. And you'd often hear people in the country saying that still. It doesn't matter, no matter what happens, no matter what stress you're going through, all will be well. There's something in your heart, in all of us, that's it's about wellness. We are well. So that's why I'm light about stuff. No matter what happens, you can be cheerful.
There's more good than bad.
There is. Far more. Yeah, I think so.
And do you come across it most days?
I do come across it every day.
Good.
And I do come across it even. I have 2 cats. And the 2 cats love each other, right?
Okay, good.
And there's one he's kind of the alpha male, and the other fella's, little fella's, like, he's half blind and he's tone deaf. And the big fella minds him all the time.
Right.
And I do look at them and I do say, there's kindness everywhere.
We have a cat, but I reserve most of my love for the dog.
Ah, well, then I wouldn't speak to you at all.
Right.
God almighty.
Right.
No.
Anyhow, explain what's happening on Thursday night. It's your chat about the Camino.
Thursday
about
night,
your dad.
What I do is with every book now over the series of memoirs, I take an armchair onto the stage and I take a podium with the book and I read some of the book and I tell stories, and basically I talk about how unwell I am, how confused I am as a human being, how desperately I went from one therapist to another, from one religion to another. I am a confused human being. And when I share that kind of fun with people, I think people enjoyed that because it's relieving for people to hear.
It's relatable as well.
Yeah, it's relieving to hear somebody's confused. The worst thing is when you meet somebody who does know everything, and they're so confident about the world, right? And what I try and share with people, and it really works, is how completely confused I am. Yeah, so that's the kind of show. It's a bit of fun.
Sure.
And I won't sing, I promise.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
We'll hold you to that then. So, it's great to talk to you, and it's great that you're coming back to An Grianan again for this book and putting it up on stage. And there's still some tickets available. That is happening tomorrow night week in An Grianan Theatre, an evening with Michael Harding. A pleasure as always, Michael. Thank you.
A pleasure, John, and thank you very much.
Take care. Look after yourself.
Bye-bye.